Well, welcome to the Arnold A. Saltzman Institute Saltzman Forum, which is made possible by the generosity of Ambassador Saltzman, and this is our 10th anniversary year as the Saltzman Institute. And this is the forum where we sometimes bring together panels of academics and practitioners to probe critical issues of the day in war and peace, and sometimes bring singular, seasoned leaders in world politics to give us the benefit of their wisdom. And today is one of the latter occasions, and it's a lucky day. It's customary, of course, to use hyperbole when introducing eminent guests, to say, I can think of no one better suited to discuss this subject. In this case, however, it's not hyperbole. I really can't think of anyone better suited to discuss diplomacy in the modern world, since Thomas Pickering is Mr. Diplomacy. It's not an exaggeration to say that he's held most of the most important posts in this business for the United States. He not only rose to the top in diplomacy, he stayed at the top and cycled through a bunch of the topmost jobs. And he's also had a set of fellowships named for him to facilitate people entering the Foreign Service. And I believe we will have some of the Pickering Fellows with us today. I want to welcome them. And to complete the welcome for our guests, I'll turn us over to Jean-Marie Guéhenno, our Associate Director and Director of the Institute's Center for International Conflict Resolution. Jean-Marie, who's a veteran diplomat at high levels himself, is just back from completing the review of France's future defense policy and programs for François Hollande, a review that you've seen in the press in the past few days. And we can thank him for recruiting Ambassador Pickering to take time for this event. Jean-Marie.
Thank you, Dick. You introduced Ambassador Pickering. I would just add that we thought there would not be a better tribute to a great diplomat, Ambassador Saltzman, than to invite to Colombia another exceptional diplomat, Tom Pickering. So without further ado, Tom, you have the floor.
Professor Betts and Jean-Marie and Ambassador Saltzman, it's a special pleasure and an honor to come up here this morning and speak to you a little bit about the challenges that we now face internationally and the role that I believe and hope diplomacy will play in them. Thank you very much for your hyperbole, Dick. A little hyperbole goes a long way, but it's always welcome. And I'm very grateful to it. And thank you, Jean-Marie, for your invitation. And it is a pleasure to be with you. Years ago, when I studied public speaking, a professor said to me, you know, your speeches ought to be like every Protestant sermon. They ought to have 3 points. And so I have 3 points this morning that I want to try to cover with you. I want to cover, as much as I can, some of the major changes taking place in the international arena that affect us, our diplomacy, and indeed our whole deployment of national assets in pursuing the interests of the United States. I'd like then to talk about some 7 major challenges that face the United States, and my third point will, in some of the cases, to speak about approaches that might involve diplomacy, perhaps in a more engaged basis than we currently see, as a way through or a way toward a resolution of those particular sets of issues. Let me begin with the blindingly obvious. Technology, science, the IT revolution are changing the world in ways that are so fast that those of us in the rapidly aging category are barely able to catch up, either with our minds or with our thumbs. Nevertheless, it is an extremely important and very significant element in today's world that we can literally be in touch with millions of people in one way or another and understand precisely what is happening from second to second around the world. And so too do governments and others who are players and custodians of our national interest or are at least beneficiaries of our national interest. So too do they have the opportunity through all of the modern methods of communication and media to stay in touch, influence outcomes, think about ideas, and cogitate everything from opinion to criticism and indeed to constructive ideas as the process goes ahead. And so it has changed remarkably where we are. A second facet of that, deriving directly from the first, and in many ways heavily influenced by it, is that diplomacy, while it is still a Westphalia game, that is, the province of states to make decisions upon, it is more and more an opportunity and a challenge for a wide variety of players in the international sphere. And so it goes without saying that foreign offices today pay a great deal of attention to other foreign offices and indeed to all the panoply of government on the other side of an issue. But they increasingly are paying attention to non-governmental organizations, to academia, to the press, to think tanks, to parliaments, and in many ways across the wide spectrum of government to all kinds of influence groups. I suppose it is no secret that 3 or 4 of the most prominent treaties which have caused the United States the greatest amount of dyspepsia in recent years have certainly been sponsored by non-governmental organizations, indeed pursued by them. And in many ways, their single-minded pursuit of the treaty has made it very difficult for the United States to negotiate in these treaties the kind of ideas that it felt it should bring to the fore to deal with them. I'll just mention landmines, small arms, the International Criminal Court as 3 of those important agreements where the United States has been left behind, sometimes breathless, in looking at those issues. And it's an important reminder that diplomacy needs to stay in touch with and indeed become part of the world of those who are going to continue and increase the amount of attention and indeed the amount of influence they bring to bear in the world of interstate relationships. I think it is also useful to mention, regardless of your political persuasion in the United States, I think it would be hard to argue the case that in the last 10 years we have found the use of force is a very poor substitute for diplomacy. That doesn't mean that diplomacy is the sovereign, rapid, and indeed complete answer to all international problems. But it does mean that those who felt that the application of force would move immovable obstacles, and that suddenly at the end of the reel we would walk off hand in hand into the sunset the way all good Hollywood musicals end, is far from the reality of Iraq and Afghanistan. And indeed, there's a very strong case to be made that while we have an enormous capacity to produce rapid and very effective combat operations, we have lost our own way at the other ends of the spectrum, if I could put it that way, in the pre-combat operation and understanding what role diplomacy could play to avoid all of that cost, blood, turmoil, and trouble. And at the other end, when in fact, in my belief, national defense might require the use of force, but wars of choice don't. At the other end, the problems that Don Rumsfeld used to characterize as nation building, but certainly the recovery from combat operations and helping countries get back to self-governance, and indeed in whatever guise we find acceptable, whether it is Swiss democracy or something less, is also important to know that we have very little in the way of capability effectively to do that. And certainly our armed forces pushed into that particular aspect of what faced them themselves have little capacity to do that. I, as an American diplomat, would certainly not want to be in a negotiation where America had a less capable military force and where its economy, as there were in days in 2008 and 2009, was seen on the verge of tilting toward collapse. But I think that we ought to keep in mind that the more you attempt to use military force to solve diplomatic problems and the more you fail, the more you undermine the capacity of military force to be a perspective leverage weight on the table of diplomatic negotiations, and the more, in fact, you undermine the military force itself for the mission it has to carry out. And that is not just desuetude and misplaced strategy. It has its potential for serious negative causes in terms of other people's underestimation of what your capacities are. And so we need to think about that. I think it is also important to think about how important economics has become. The traditional practitioners of diplomacy are more or less educated in the political field, often by their own on-the-job training as diplomats, and tend to concentrate within that stovepipe. And the economic folks are in another stovepipe. They occasionally move back and forth. In the United States, we find it hard to find well-trained economists who will become diplomats. And so, in fact, for at least 24 years, we've had a very effective one-year master's level course of our own to take those who are less literate in economics up onto the stage of being more capable in economics, and many of those have done very well. But one only has to look at the financial crisis of 2008 and its continued influence on many of the problems that we face to understand how important the new focus on economics, and I suppose many associated social questions, has become. And then there is a final point that I'd like to make in setting the stage a little bit for where change has taken place. I think it's important in thinking about strategy for us to begin to try to think beyond the traditional stovepipes that have characterized our view of the areas or the frames within which diplomacy should operate. And here, quite simply, an illustration of the interrelationship between energy policy, environmental policy, and climate change is perhaps a special species or variety or challenge of environmental policy works. Certainly, like the proverbial balloon, if you push in on one edge, it bulges on the other. In many ways, changes that you make in your energy policy have a profound effect on your ability to meet environmental goals, and in many ways to deal with particularly the problem of carbon production and its influence on climate change. And so looking at that grouping, and that grouping is now, I think, very much in the consideration of many people as they look at it strategically, an important and emblematic indication of this interrelationship. And I feel there are many others. And in fact, I will, in talking about the challenges to the United States, attempt to bring together in a basket 7 major issues which are heavily interrelated of other strands of questions that we have traditionally thought about as being in their own stovepipe, being considered alone. I think that there's no real question strategically about thinking about the changes within the traditional stovepipes, but the value of looking at them strategically as very closely interrelated is the value of, on the one hand, avoiding the unintended or unexpected consequences that often flow from that interrelationship, and on the other hand, in a more diplomatic sense, in a more negotiating sense, being able to understand how in finding a solution to a problem, it may often be weighted in your favor by finding issues in an analogous and interrelated piece that can be put on the table and become part of the settlement rather than necessarily be excluded. So you can sometimes enrich the mix of diplomatic leverage and outcomes by bringing in other interrelated questions for solution, and indeed, sometimes if you don't think about them and the other side is, then you have a missed opportunity in your diplomacy. I would say one thing further. It does seem to me that if all of these related questions are true. Diplomacy as a profession is going to be more heavily taxed than ever before. It's going to have a wider scope of activity and operations. It's going to demand, in all honesty, a significant amount of additional professionalism as it is dealt with, and deeper training. And in many ways, the traditional approach, particularly in the United States, has been a very limited amount of introductory training to diplomats, put them in their first jobs, see if they can survive 3 years of examination in their first jobs, after which they graduate to a semi-protected tenured status. After which we focus very heavily on language training, almost to the exclusion of everything else, with occasional short catch-ups, small bursts of activity, often to teach tradecraft, which is very important, how to protect yourself in an insecure environment, for example, or what you need to know in 2 weeks about South Asia. But beyond that, everything else is pretty much learned on the job. And we have begun to think about that in a more focused way. And I think over a period of time, we need to do it. Our friends in the military do that very well. But in the main, the military has 2 modes, training and operations. We have only one as diplomats, and that's operations. The Congress, in its generosity, funds the military even when it's not in combat. The Congress has never been tested on whether they will fund the State Department for training when it's not in combat. We're continuing to push for that because up until now, with rare exceptions, every diplomat who gets a training assignment means we have one less diplomat on the front line of diplomacy. There has been no special provision, in fact, to allow positions or jobs to do that. Let me now shift, if I can, to talk about some of the challenges I see out there in the broader dimension of clusters and groups of challenges that are interrelated. And it is always an interesting problem in looking at these, to which I should give first priority. The world is a constantly changing place, and many things are shifting, even as we look at them on a daily basis. But I would say that, in keeping with my thought that economics remains a close and important question for us to keep watch upon, I think it is useful and important to start with something that has heavily bedeviled us as a country, our friends in Europe and the international community since 2008. And it was, in effect, the mega crisis in finance and beyond that began with the seemingly nearly innocent practice of lumping good mortgages with bad in the United States and labeling the whole thing as A1. And when that crisis came home to roost, it went far enough, as you all know, to threaten our banking establishment, to threaten a number of our major industries. It ricocheted around the world and threatened others, and certainly came close to cascading Greece into some kind of indefined, undefinable limbo of inoperativeness. I suppose bankruptcy would be the appropriate word for it, but we like to avoid that. It certainly challenged and changed the European community from an organization that was worried about its next steps for expansion and how and in what way it could functionally improve itself to an organization that was totally consumed for many periods of time, including now with its self-preservation. These were important. And certainly, we have the massive problem in the United States left over, but certainly very much on our charge, of dealing with a very large and I think increasing debt in a situation where at least half the country believes that the sovereign remedy is to reduce taxes and see if we can find an easy way to cut government and move ourselves out of that conundrum, while the other half of the country has almost the opposite point of view. And one would have thought that for any normal country, any reasonable country, one could have found the way. And indeed, the president appointed a commission, which gave him, I thought, some reasonable advice that you have to do something of both. The exact ratios are subject to conversation, but that ought to really take place, and we're still struggling. My own feeling is that we still play a huge role in the balance wheel of international economics, and we need to be certain and sure not only of our own future, but how we affect the rest of the world. And our diplomacy in approaching the crisis was a very real and very vigorous one. And the crisis, as I said, extended from a simple problem of home mortgages all the way across the field of economics, to bank stability, to macroeconomic policy, to the influence on trade and many other things. And it is that congery of questions that we have to wrestle with. I think we are gradually finding a way to move forward. It is interesting that many of the lessons of the 1930s and of some of the other crises since then seem to have been absorbed. On the other hand, I believe we are all frustrated by the fact that our recovery, predicted originally as being long and hard, is indeed that and perhaps a great deal more. And there is much we have to do, I think, to strike out in a cooperative way in the international community to deal with this issue. We have seen some efforts at creating new institutions to deal with part of the problem. But I think that there has been less attention, in my view, to the diplomacy of recovery than there has been, I think, to the challenge that recovery presents to all of us. And in many ways, we are not yet, in my view, equipped to or up to the task of finding our way through. The second question that I would put on the table for you, because it involves worldwide scope, is the challenge, or the growing challenge, the almost untrammeled challenge of the Middle East, stemming from perhaps the Pillars of Hercules to the Hindu Kush. It involved, when I first started talking about it, three I-word problems: Iran, Iraq, and what to do about Israel and the Arabs. We have now seen, of course, in our infinite capacity to add challenges and complexities, certainly with the cooperation of many other people, Afghanistan and Pakistan, or as I would prefer to call it, Pakistan and Afghanistan. And in many ways, the most interesting, and now about to go into its third extended year, crisis in the Arabic-speaking world, certainly from Morocco all the way around to Iraq and down to Yemen. Let me speak about each of these very quickly, because we could spend a whole day on any one of them. My sense is that the most difficult of the Arab transformation problems is certainly Syria today, despite the fact that Egypt remains very unsettled, has a possibility of facing new elections, and there remain great discrepancies between certainly expectations in Egypt and what might actually eventuate. Certainly in Egypt, the problem of finding an increasingly religiously motivated regime attempting to deal with its liberals in the streets who haven't gone home, and with a military which seeks, in my view, to hide from controversy, but is not necessarily going to see the country totally transformed against its interests, as well as a religious group not yet in power, and certainly in many ways more extreme than the Muslim Brotherhood, than the Ikhwan, but ready, of course, to have its own role if it can sell the public on where it's to go. But Egypt pales certainly in complexity and difficulty and challenge to what's happening in Syria, despite their differences in population. One cannot help but be struck by two or three tendencies we now see in Syria. The growing number weekly of people dying, 6,500 according to the UN within recent weeks each week. the propensity of the problem to become more radicalized, in a sense that al-Qaeda influence is certainly growing among the Syrian opposition in the Jusrat al-Nusra Front, as well as in other organizations, and it's clear their ability to fight and their commitment to fight is attracting more recruits than the moderates, who are deeply divided and in many ways badly disorganized. I think that on the other side, we also ought to pay attention to the fact that an intensive amount of Iranian training through the Revolutionary Guard, of Alawite militias called the Young Army, is clearly beginning to create among the Alawites, not traditionally radicalized, a much more radicalized influence on the government side, together with the recruitment of an untrained militia, the Shabiha, who have in fact become, unfortunately, masters at cruel and unusual extermination tactics in the Syrian conflict. Besides that, Syria is unnerving and deeply destabilizing to the region around it. Certainly to Jordan, which has all of its own problems compounded these days. To Lebanon, where Syria has had an inordinate influence for decades, if not more. To southern Turkey, even to Iraq, where it is heightening what I think is still an ongoing civil conflict in Iraq by even more polarization of Sunni and Shia elements in the country. There isn't much at this point that one can see that could be done. There are, as usual with all problems looked at by government, three options. One option is allow things to continue, perhaps feed them all, do more arming, let the whole crisis play out in the kind of orgy of conflict that has been going on now for 2.5 years or 2 years. I'm not sure that anybody finds this acceptable, but it seems to me that it is impossible to believe that if they don't find it acceptable, they haven't shied in any way away from being part of it. The U.S. is being very cautious, and I think the President is deeply concerned by the military conflict getting out of hand. The second alternative, in my view, is to believe that there is an early military solution to this stalemate, and to seek, in one way or another, to make that happen through outside intervention. We already see in Syria a civil war that has international dimensions, with Russia and Iran playing heavily on one side, Turkey, Qatar, Saudi Arabia, the United States, and others playing on the other side. This, in my view, has no benefit to Syria and little possibility of early resolution. And I can't believe, despite occasional voices of optimism from Washington, that an enhanced engagement will make things move in a way that is positive for anybody, particularly the Syrian public. And of course, the growing refugee tide is a perfect indication of why that's extremely difficult. The third option is a very hard one. It's a diplomatic option. It's an option that the United Nations, I think, in many ways, reluctantly took on with the Arab League. It's been stalled for some time. I don't know that there is an easy formula. I do think that one thing that could tilt a little more favorably toward a political solution through diplomacy would be to see if the United States and Russia might find common cause. There, I think there are 4 elements that might be useful for the two of them to think through a little more clearly. 2 are procedural. One is the United States, with the Syrian opposition, insistence that there be preconditions to discussion. No talks can take place unless Assad goes, in one form or another. The second is maybe more nefarious but harder to root out in its linkage. that nothing can be agreed in political discussions until everything is agreed. Perfectly fine diplomatic formula, but in this case, in my view, very inappropriate to what we have on hand. The two substantive steps that I think need to be considered are a humanitarian ceasefire as soon as possible, monitored but certainly beyond the possibility of being enforced by the United Nations. And the only way that that will come is when the parties who have influence with both sides see the present situation as leading to more disadvantages than it leads to advantages. And I think that requires careful analysis and some good introspection as much as it does anything else. And finally, if you could get a ceasefire, and I'm not a naive, I know how hard that would be, but I don't think it's impossible. But if you could get a ceasefire, then immediately it has to be taken advantage of in the context of the Geneva Kofi Annan plan. The next step in that plan was the negotiation of an interim government or a transitional government for Syria. My own view is that that's almost an impossible task. Nobody comes to the negotiating table set to agree, or even, in my view, after this kind of a conflict, persuadable that he should leave the seat. But it is possible to pick up on an idea I first heard from a People's Republic of China diplomat when I pressed on what their views were toward a solution. And they said, well, it's obvious the people of Syria have to choose where it is they go. And my own view is that if you could get a ceasefire, then the next thing to do is to move to an electoral commission. An electoral commission is not going to be easy. It's something the United Nations knows a good bit about, maybe not perfectly. But I would do everything to see that an electoral commission was dominated by the UN, which knows how to run a good election, but was fully cooperated in by representatives of Syrian parties. The electoral commission's job would be simple: to see to the election of a constituent assembly, which at one time would be a parliament to choose the next government, even if temporary, and also, against some kind of deadline, to seek to draft a new constitution for Syria. All of this is very millennial. All of this is very hard. But in my view, if not tried, we will never know. And certainly in my view that all conflicts end with political implications. And if you're not prepared to try to shape those, then every sense of the word, you're going to have to accept what's dealt to you from the hand of untrammeled fate on these particular issues. And I'm not sure that will be necessarily very good. Let me briefly discuss a few other issues in the Middle East and then go on to some of the other challenges before I lose you all in fits of despair. I think that we are fast running out of steam on a two-state solution for the Arab-Israeli conflict. On the other hand, I haven't heard anybody tell me what the alternative really is. The one-state solution has more opponents than it has certainly supporters at the moment. We are seeing an Israeli prime minister perhaps in his last term, and one would hope that he's beginning to think about his historical legacy as much as he has been thinking in the past about staying in office in a very difficult, fractious coalition. There are signs, but only early signs, that Hamas and al-Fatah are once again eyeing the possibility of coming together. In the recent election in Hamas of Khalid Mishal, who is certainly not the most extreme extremist, is an interesting sign and should be taken into account. The real problem that I've seen for a long time in the Middle Eastern negotiations is that the biggest difficulty is not with what the solution would look like. I think most people know within millimeters on a scale of a meter where that would have to come, but to get the parties to face up to their obligations and responsibilities to make the tough concessions that will have to be made if that's to be the case. Secretary Kerry's interest in taking it on, the President's recent visit, and his support for Secretary Kerry are significant and important items. I would have to say that with respect, a Secretary of State can take on perhaps only one major issue and still do his or her job in running the State Department. This is a huge and heavy burden. I suppose that if I were the president, I would have looked around and perhaps fastened my eyes on Bill Clinton as potentially the one person who knows as much about this as anybody else, who knows what the risks are, and still hasn't won his Nobel Peace Prize. But I don't know that that's in the offing, and there are other considerations that you can all think of that make that hard. A word about Iraq. I said earlier I was worried about Iraq's continued incipient and untrammeled civil conflict. Syria is not making it any better. You can walk away, but you can't shake it off in many ways. Iraq is an important player in the energy world, in the Middle Eastern world. And we will, for all of our investment, continue, I believe, to have to pay very careful attention to Iraq. Iran, as you know, has been a problem of galloping importance. I will only say the following, and I have, over a period of years, followed Iran and the nuclear question carefully. My sense is that procedurally, maybe it's the influence of U.S. sanctions, maybe it's a deeper concern shared by the publics in both the United States and Iran about the potential for any kind of wider war. Maybe it is the beginning of an understanding that after 33 years of mistrust and misunderstanding, the negotiating table is the only possible alternative to even worse consequences. But for whatever reasons, we have been meeting more often. There have been proposals put on the table which have not been, as in the past, instantly rejected. We are not consuming long days trying to negotiate about when to meet again. The meetings are on the order of once every 2 or 3 months rather than once every year. There is a proposal on the table, I understand, from the Western side for a cessation and 20% enrichment and some other arrangements to complement that. There's been proposals, although fairly weak ones, on sanctions relief, and I think that's probably where the negotiation will have to focus its attention. Iran would certainly like to be able to have, from the other side, some endorsement, acceptance, ratification, or general willingness to submit on its continued ability to enrich, and that seems to be highly possible within the constraints of a program which is really dedicated to a peaceful nuclear future for Iran. And at some point, Iran will have to spell that out a little more carefully if it expects the other side to have some confidence. So I think sanctions, the dimensions of a longer-term program, the potential for sanctions relief, the potential for an early partial agreement, perhaps after the Iranian elections in mid-June, is something that certainly should be pushed for by both sides. And seemingly they find it harder now to walk away from negotiations than they have to persist, although anybody who expects immediate miracles, I think, is probably barking up the wrong tree. I'll only say the following about Afghanistan and Pakistan. We are getting out next year of Afghanistan in the main. The president will have to define what he leaves behind. I have always thought that we really should have called the whole problem Pakistan and Afghanistan. Pakistan is by far the larger, bigger, most important and salient problem in the region, and one that as a result we and others should be paying much more attention to. It's a problem with nuclear dimensions, it's a problem with religious dimensions, it's a problem with ethnic dimensions, it's a problem that could, if not dealt with very carefully, cause a conflict in the subcontinent. It's a problem that is susceptible, in my view, to further diplomatic work, despite the fact that we shy away from it. It's a problem that involves not just Pakistan alone, but Afghanistan and India certainly, and perhaps other states in the region and the United States. Those dimensions, I believe, call out for more clear thinking about a future framework in that area. Let me now go briefly to 4 or 5 other clusters of problems, again, each worthy of time and attention. One that I'd like to call rivals and partners would really involve China, Russia, India, the European Union, Japan, and perhaps Brazil and another country, if you wish to choose to put another one in, that are all large and important players on the world scene, all in one way or another continental players. The European Union is not yet a country, but it is not without some unified policies that we have to deal with. It seems to me that in each of these, for the United States, the challenge is inordinately important, that we need to be paying a lot more attention than we are. I think the pivot, if it represented a commitment to increased attention across the board by the United States to Asia, is the right approach. I think the name was badly conceived, and even the alternative name, rebalancing. It tends to look at the problem as a zero-sum effort, when we are capable, obviously, of increasing our effort in Asia without necessarily drawing down everywhere else. And it belies the fact that we are still deeply engaged in at least one major war in the region, even if we don't consider it traditional Asia. And it's important to look at that. I do think that in many cases, some examples of success in dealing with countries of this size, scope, and strength has been very important to us. And that's the simple process of choosing the appropriate, correct issues to work on. Those where there are win-win possibilities, as opposed to zero-sum or even lose-lose. And we can think of a number of those. Certainly arms control arrangements with the Russians have proven in the past, even coming out of the Soviet era, as being important kinds of questions to work on diplomatically for those answers. I think that the new and growing Chinese interest in climate change, the new and growing Chinese interest in energy, and how and in what way we can work together to deal with potential energy shortages and with new energy, with the technology of energy are very important. And one can see other issues that might well be win-win, interest to both the US and China. And one can see that across the board. And I think it is not an exercise in rocket science to believe that if we can find enough win-win to build on, we can also find a way to end what I would call malevolently inspired policies, particularly in the US-Russia context, that are out there aggravating in a lose-lose way some of the other issues. And so it is the questions of Magnitsky Bill and adoptions. There are other questions where, in fact, the US and Russia have engaged in a dominant policy of what I like to call ankle kicking, as opposed to finding ways to move through to get answers to issues. This is something that has to be done on both sides. One side can't do it alone, but I think it can help. We have and sometimes approached ankle kicking with China, but so far I think successfully avoided a serious case of it. But we do need to look at this, and I think it's an important and serious question on the way to proceed. A fourth major set of problems for us, deeply linked in some ways with the others, is the problem presented to us by weapons of mass destruction. We see a minor case of serious and growing anguish in Syria on this issue. And hopefully it could become a kind of catalyst that would set off a further interest in not seeing more of this kind of activity. One wonders. I don't see a ready-to-hand, easy military answer, but one can see also very tough possibilities of moving it into some kind of negotiating scenario. But all across the spectrum, from disarmament and arms control to military strategy, to in fact what kinds of end games you adopt and how you seek to proceed with them. The whole issue of weapons of mass destruction is a very important question. It bedevils us on Iran and North Korea. We share that with many others. It is important, in my view, that a number of steps continue to be taken to keep people on board with non-proliferation policy. I think it is very serious for us to begin to look at loopholes in the non-proliferation treaty which seemingly present opportunities for countries to develop technologies under their civil programs, which then put them in a position, in some cases rapidly, to move into military programs. And here those sensitive technologies, the enrichment of uranium and the separation of plutonium from used up nuclear fuel from power plants and other production reactors, is an important and significant effort. Here I would like to see the nuclear powers take the lead and in many ways join together and say, in effect, that they will, on a competitive basis, provide nuclear fuel for any country that wishes to develop reactors, that a certain amount of fuel should be put in the hands of the International Atomic Energy Agency to guard against the possibility that holding back on nuclear fuel supply to countries in good keeping and in good standing with their non-proliferation objectives did not become a point of political leverage. This, in my view, would be very useful. An even more important piece would be, in my view, that anyone who wishes to enter into this field, and it should begin with the present nuclear powers, is in fact going to multilateralize the ownership and operation of the facilities, as well as accept fully the most extensive international atomic energy safeguards. These elements of transparency and the inability, if I could put it this way, for one state fully to control this process is important. The five nuclear powers have all agreed to make no more fissile material for use in weapons, and that's been in place for over 15 years. That needs, in my view, to be reinforced. And while we can't get yet a treaty to do that, because at least one of the new nuclear powers is standing against it, it is, in my view, important to adopt something along the lines of multilateralization and real limitations on the control and production of nuclear material in order to stop this. I also think that an enormous amount of very interesting work is going on about how and in what way the nuclear world could go to zero. Many people have laughed and thought it was chimerical, and many people think it's excessively naive. But I was stirred when 5 years ago, Henry Kissinger, Bill Perry, Sam Nunn, and George Shultz, none of them certified loonies, and certainly none of them one would call nuclear softies, came forward with the notion that it was important for us to look into this particular issue and see, in fact, whether there were ways that we could move in this direction. And we're increasingly seeing ways in which conventional deterrence can play a useful role. We're increasingly seeing ways in which inspection, control, and monitoring can be more effective in dealing with this issue. We're not at the millennium yet, but we do see for the first time both the United States and Russia committed to this, and I believe the United States and Russia, in their various recent disarmament steps, including New START, have moved in the direction of zero, even if in fact they are still a significant way from getting there. Let me then turn to two or three other problem sets that challenge us in a very serious way. The most interesting, one of the most important, and certainly one of the longest standing, is a giant cluster of issues that I would begin by describing as poverty, growth, and development, food, health, and water, failed and failing states, trade issues, international narcotics and crime, migration challenges, and so on. But you can add a host of questions, that interrelated set of issues, which is often still looked at very much in its key elements as much as it is looked at as a nexus of problem sets to be dealt with. The United States has traditionally played an important role in this region. It will be a challenging PhD thesis to look at the various twists and turns in U.S. development policy over the years. I suppose if I had one problem, it's been too many changes. And a second problem in development policy has been the beguiling premise that if we only did one thing well, that would help us in dealing with the host of related and other problems. Whereas I think that that's a difficulty. The third, and none of these, I think, in the hyperbolic way I've described them, has been actually the U.S. policy. It's just had a tendency to move in that direction. But the third is that one policy fits all, that what will work in Tanzania will work in Russia. And to some extent, people have tried that. It didn't work very well. And so we need, as I think we are now trying to do, fine-tuned approaches. The Millennium Challenge idea was wonderful, that countries which practice democracy, have good governments, are committed to moving further in that direction, ought to get the lion's share of our assistance. But what do we do for all the people who are, one way or another, condemned to live under bad governments, whose governments are not going soon to pick up the challenge of moving toward a more democratic future? Do we deny them help? At one point, this was a controversy. I think it no longer is. The approach in policy terms is to try to find ways to help them, of course, get to a better economic, political, and governance status over a period of time, even if they don't get special preferences in assistance, and so on. So that we have much out there to challenge us. There have been many failings. They are not all the problems of local governments. On the other hand, it is very, very clear that local governments are a very necessary condition to making serious progress. They may be a very necessary condition. They're certainly not the sufficient condition that outside players need also to be very much involved in moving these issues ahead. We find, as we have over the years, that trade has been a very important denominator of growth and a very important influence in many parts of the developing world in moving themselves out of the kind of deep poverty and difficulty they have traditionally faced. Again, not the sole answer. Again, an answer that has differential impact. Again, an answer that depends on the willingness of major world countries to open their gates to the kind of trade that's involved. And anybody who has dealt with textiles in the United States will know that that's a formidable problem. Almost every state at one point had a serious interest in the United States in textile manufacturers. And it is still a major share of the business of many American states. And the tendency toward protectionism in that particular field is very large. An interesting example is that in the first year after NAFTA was passed, back in the Clinton administration, the state that derived statistically the largest benefit from the new trade was, very interesting, North Carolina, then the home of Senator Jesse Helms, whose admiration and loving for NAFTA was not very large. The next set of problems I mentioned earlier, and I won't dwell on it at length because I think you understand it: energy, environment, and climate change. Here we are seeing rapid transformations. However, see if that's mine. Nope. Anybody who believes that we are now approaching the millennium, where absolute U.S. energy independence leaves us unfettered in the world in any serious way, has really got to go back and re-examine that premise. But I hear it a lot. I hear it all the time. My sense is that think about the globe as big and round. Think about business as unlimited by frontiers. Think about energy as an interrelated problem. After all, while there are different prices in energy, they relate to such differentiators as scarcity, transportation distance, and quality, not basically where it comes from in a specific sense. And people who have sought to lock up oil reserves in foreign countries soon find that the first clause of the contract is a price escalator related to world prices. And so it's important to believe that we and those that we trade with, and many who help to contribute to our prosperity, are going to be as concerned by energy sources, scarcity in relationships, and that autonomy in managing our own energy may provide some benefits, but it is far from a bright and serious new world in where that's going. And let me just end with one set of additional factors that I think it's important to keep in mind. All of us, in looking at the challenges that are out there and facing us in the world ahead, need to know and understand that governments do play a continued important role, and so increasingly do international organizations. The United States is beautifully equipped with a 1947 act that in fact was the major last reconstruction of our foreign affairs and security posture. There is arguably some reason to believe that it may be a little bit out of date. It's been brought up and chivied along, but in many ways our biggest problems are how do we get the opportunity across a very large and ramified government to face the problems that we have to face together by working together. And it's the common term whole of government approach is very significant. And so we are trying, but we are not there. Our system is not well made to make that happen, particularly when the question comes of facing a crisis and pulling together. And inevitably, the first issue that always comes up is who's going to pay for it. And certainly, the departments with big budgets are always looked to and always have found ways to fence themselves off so that, in fact, they're almost untouchable. And the departments with small budgets are in even worse shape. So we do need, in a situation in which we traditionally attempt to have a budget plan for not the next year, but the year ahead, to the Congress at the beginning of the year, the notion that we have the perspicacity and indeed the genius to understand the role, nature, scope, and strength of all the problems we're going to face in that long period ahead and budget for it is certainly beyond any sense of reality. And so we constantly need to seek a way to build into our governmental processes not just the ways to bring people to work together and how to lead that effort, but also how to fund it. Of course, we have the opportunity, and we have, sometimes to our disadvantage, funded wars off budget. But we need to think about how on budget you can provide the flexibility to do the kind of diplomacy that we're challenged with. Diplomacy now costs us, in budgetary terms, about $50 billion a year. That's all foreign assistance, which occupies the biggest share. The cost of diplomats, their functions and operations, is 10% of that $50 billion. The $50 billion represents about 1% of our GDP and slightly more of our budget, but not much more. And so that needs to be looked at. The second is the international framework. Downtown here on the east side, we have the only organization to which we have delegated the power, in effect, to legislate for the international community. It's, of course, limited in very narrow ways to dealing with problems of international peace and security. Many consider the Security Council of the United Nations very unrepresentative, and in many ways it is. And of course, if it were perfectly representative, it would be 193 countries, and then it would be perfectly immobile. And so we have, in effect, made a compromise. And the really interesting question, should a number of larger countries not permanently on the Security Council be there? And to some extent, we are still engaged in dancing around on that question. There are those who have the veto who don't like company in that club. There are those in regions who see themselves as opposed to, in one way or another, countries that might be brought into permanent membership. The best that we can do right now is to bring people on larger states with more influence, perhaps, for longer-term stays. I myself think that that makes sense. While it's totally heretical, my own view, too, is that as we go ahead, we ought to address the veto. I think, on the one hand, those states that would like to be permanent members would like to have the veto. But I think that we really ought to go back and see whether there is a way to approach the veto in the Security Council that relegates it, in a sense, to what the charter shapers really had in mind, that the 5 permanent members would be asked to provide the majority of forces, if they were needed, to carry out the peace, and therefore they ought to have the right to say no if, in fact, that challenge was before them. And it was certainly a necessary compromise to get, certainly then, the Soviet Union and the United States on board in a situation where otherwise they could see themselves outvoted by the other. But what if we had a way of doing one or two things? Much more narrowly circumscribing the use of the veto to only those issues where a major issue of national security and interest played a role. Hard, maybe difficult to define, certainly worthy of being looked at. Another might be to see whether, through agreement among the 5 permanent members, and I think this is not possible now, but it might have been possible 10 or 15 years ago, to agree that unless 3 of them was against any particular draft resolution, the others would at least abstain. Both of those, I think, well beyond any possibility now. But in looking at enlargement, I think we ought to look at other aspects of the Security Council to improve its effectiveness. Certainly, such an arrangement with respect to veto, if limited solely to cases of genocide, ought at least to be saleable and appealing to even the most reluctant of the permanent members of the Security Council. And certainly I can think of no case in which U.S. interests would have been in any way negatively affected in a case of genocide by having a veto arrangement of that character in place. If you couldn't get 3 votes against, then the resolution would go through. And of course, in the end, it would help in negotiating resolutions. You might get more robust resolutions out of the process, which is really the end of the game. Well, I've talked for long enough. I know that Dick and Jean-Marie are here paying me by the word, so I've enjoyed it all. I'm delighted to have had the chance to lay out for you some of these issues, to talk about diplomacy and the challenges it has to face. None of these are particularly easy. All of them, in my view, involve an increasing measure of international cooperation. It may not be right that President Obama believes in leading from behind, but what I think is enshrined in those words is much more likely leading. And leading means that it is not diktat. It means consultation. It means hard work at finding formulas that can bring people along which can still effectively do the job. These are the challenges of diplomacy. I think the change in U.S. standing in the world and many of the questions asked by the United States impels it to get smarter in its leadership, to get wiser in its approaches, to do more with the tools that it has at hand, and to pay greater attention to the international community as it seeks to go ahead. Whatever one may say about the United States today, it remains important that in the most difficult problems, in the biggest crises, a very large share of the world community, before it says what it wants to do, usually asks the question of what does the United States think we ought to do? And that's a mark of some recognition, if not respect. It's an approach that we, I think, would shed lightly, and it's an approach that I believe will be important for us to pay a great deal of attention to in the time ahead. So let me now turn to whatever it is that's next, questions and answers. Thanks.
Well, thank you so much, Ambassador, for what really was a superb lecture where you covered so much ground with a combination of deep knowledge and also creative proposals, ideas to make the world system a better place. So I'll just ask a couple of questions and maybe open it up to the audience. Questions, comments. I mean, at the beginning of your lecture, you spoke about all the new actors who are now part of the international conversation, and the fact that the diplomats don't operate in the traditional Westphalian environment. And one element of that is the search for more transparency. And when one looks at transparency, there is obviously an upside, especially if one comes from a democratic country. At the same time, some would say that it can complicate things, and that sometimes diplomacy is better done between closed door than in the front of the public. And so I think we would all be interested in having your view on the balance between the balance sheet between those two aspects of new diplomacy.
An extremely good question, Jean-Marie. I think there is no immutable meter in which the needle will ever be pointing to the appropriate balance. It's a case-by-case consideration. On the side of transparency is the need for a public that backs a diplomacy to understand what's going on. And it needs to be brought in. And there is always a fashion in government of either providing too little or perhaps too much. It's the difference between secrets and spinning. And in some ways, that has to be handled with care. We can look, for example, at WikiLeaks. I suppose that there were several potential and real problems with WikiLeaks. One was that there was so much stuff that it took a long time for people actually to read and appreciate what was there. Secondly, a lot of it turned out to be fairly pedestrian. Thirdly, at least for American diplomats, there was an innate realization that people could write simple English fairly straightforwardly, and that there was not, in effect, always a second game unseen going on in the diplomacy, that people were writing and talking about the things in private that were in one way or another part of the public record of the problem and in dealing with them. The negative aspects were that 2 American ambassadors were declared persona non grata, one very unfortunately to Mexico, and another, not in my view, terribly unfortunately, to Libya, because Muammar Gaddafi, who threw him out later himself, ended with a more difficult fate. Not that the two were linked in any way at all. So one could argue that through a combination of leaks and briefings and things of that sort, there's an awful lot out there. I would argue that it is also important for diplomats to have an opportunity to speak privately to their governments. And I believe it is true that the cables that were released in WikiLeaks were in the main the cables that were widely shared in the government. And the cables that are not widely shared in the government happily were not released in WikiLeaks. So that there is more to come if in fact you believe in the inevitability of leaks. But those in the main are the very sensitive questions in which diplomats are asked or encouraged to provide their views. So I believe that there is a necessary private aspect to diplomacy. Some of that involves trying out solutions. Some of that involves exchanging ideas. Diplomats are paid to listen as much as they are to talk. And in many ways, their tremendous ability to listen and record is one of their strongest suits in bringing governments along with what has to take place. I think finally, for an American diplomat at least, any negotiation is often even harder between you and Washington than it is with your opposite number in the foreign government across the table from you. And you have to be able, in many ways, to handle that problem with the same degree of care and indeed confidentiality that I believe helps you to make the process move ahead, particularly when in periods of time when American political life is deeply divided and diplomatic issues of some sort or another become the source for increasing polarization. I was asked by Secretary Clinton to lead a panel to look into the death of our ambassador in Benghazi and 3 others. And it was appalling when I started to read the news reports. And I made it my job to read every report the State Department could collect on Benghazi from U.S. domestic press and salient ones from the foreign press. And I have to tell you that the inventive quality of some of those stories was unsurpassed. But their relationships to reality were lamentably totally distant. And it made you at least wonder what we had come to. Happily, there was at work, but in a minor key, an effort on the part of some journalists to do what I think the First Amendment originally envisaged, which was to conduct a debate over the issue and to dispute facts in error or facts imagined that one way or another became prominent in the debate. But it hardly slowed things down. And of course, it was an inordinately terrible time for us in many ways. But one of the worst aspects of that was that it took place right in the middle of a major American election campaign, where the polarization was great, and where obviously some saw this particular question as being an important area of potential vulnerability for the party in power, and as a result, it got blown up in ways that I think went past all imagining.
Maybe one other question, and then I'll open up to the audience. You were ambassador in the United Nations, I think, right when the Cold War ended. And that was a time of great hopes for global governance. And today we see with Syria that the Security Council as a very difficult time coming together on many issues. And that suggests for some that more informal settings like the G20 will become more and more prominent. Some would say that the global institutions will gradually become less central, and be interesting to have your views on that.
I think, Jean-Marie, to take a look at this in the longer perspective, one has to look at the worst days of the Security Council, which were during the Cold War. And the number of times in which agreement could be reached was very limited, and tended to affect issues which were very routine. My first month in New York as U.S. representative to the UN was March of 1989. And the Security Council did not meet that whole month, even in an administrative session. And we had a wonderful young woman ambassador from Senegal who was president. And she was bereft that she never got an opportunity to be president of the Security Council, and she was about to leave. So you can understand. But by August of 1990, with the Iraqi invasion of Kuwait, things moved into very high gear. And as a result of that, we were meeting intensively. But I could see that by 1992, and it's of course a lot more apparent in retrospect, that the success in 1990 and 91 of the Security Council in dealing with the Iraqi invasion of Kuwait had its helpful implications, but it had misleading implications. We, in fact, moved then rapidly to try to find ways to deal with the breakup of Yugoslavia and with an insurgency, a multiple insurgency in Somalia. And in neither case did we have, despite the potential to unanimity, very clear ideas on how to deal with these particular sets of issues. And perhaps because we lacked the drama of Saddam's invasion of Kuwait, and we lacked the kind of commitment that built on the part of many countries around the world to help deal with it, things went back into a mode that was not Cold War, but it was a mode that grew discouraged by the failures, as you know, Jean-Marie, of peacekeeping arrangements, which are seen then as the key to dealing with these hot and growing conflicts to be effective. And as a result, I think there grew a lot of skepticism about it. Some of that took on a character of, you can't do that to my friends. And that also plays a role. I think that, unfortunately, that's probably the more realistic piece. I believe that the mandatory role of the Security Council has to be carefully guarded. If it is used too often and in ways that are not going to be followed, then it undermines whatever authority the Security Council may have had. But it is, among the bodies, the only body, as I said earlier, that the member states are pledged to accept as an action on the part of an international body that binds them. The G20, in my view, has great possibilities, but they are more, in that sense, consultative and perhaps consensus building than they are action-oriented and operational in a very real sense. The G20 could be used as a way to put together peacekeeping, but it would have trouble legitimating it. The Security Council, in fact, plays an important role there, and we ought to be careful not to undermine that role. I dealt extensively with the G8, and that was hard enough. And in fact, the G8 became a kind of G15, because at various times we had leaders of the developing world attend the meetings and participate and give us their thoughts and ideas. It was helpful, but my view, not millennial in terms of its effectiveness. I believe that we need to think about the whole structure of the G-denominated organizations. Some of them, particularly the foreign ministers of the largest economies, and particularly the heads of state of the largest economies, still have a very important role to play. And it was quite interesting that in the springtime of every year, when those meetings began to build up to the summit meetings in June, the political directors of the G8 countries addressed together with the foreign ministers a series of important questions that were on the agenda of the United Nations, but about which their ability to speak in common using the advantage of having the G8 meetings was particularly useful and helpful. And I think that building into those arrangements would be important. And I think that subgroups or smaller G configurations within the G20 might be useful. But the real problem is that once you're on the G20, you never want to absent yourself or to be excluded from a meeting. Otherwise, you lose the standing that you have. And as you know, the G20 is now, what, Jean-Marie, 28 or 25, with various others who have been attached informally. I can tell you that it was my experience that the Economic and Social Council of the United Nations, when it was enlarged, became a lot less effective than when it was smaller. And to some extent, that's also an important consideration. I think there needs to be mixtures of large and small. My own feeling is that the General Assembly, if it speaks in terms of a large majority on a particularly important issue, can be important, particularly if it's speaking in terms that appeal widely to solutions to problems of one sort or another. It may be that because it has become a major resolution factory, it is hard to pick out those issues. But I can recall in my time here, the United States was not ready to sign the Law of the Sea Treaty. And our particular problem was seabed mining. And we used the General Assembly resolutions for 2 years on seabed subjects and law of the sea subjects to signal that we were ready to come to the table to negotiate a protocol to the Law of the Sea Treaty that others seemingly, as we had begun to frame it, were willing to accept. That led to the Secretary General putting together a consultative group to which we came. That led to the negotiation of a protocol to the Law of the Sea Treaty. That led to U.S. signature, but unfortunately, President Clinton didn't move fast enough. And so we still haven't got it, and it remains on the agenda. But nevertheless, there are no substantive U.S. objections from the U.S. executive branch to the Law of the Sea Treaty. And it was through that process of grouping and signaling that we were able to move it.
Thank you. I will now open the floor. Introduce yourself and ask crisp questions, no speeches, so that
Professor, if you want to call on people, I'll bring them a microphone, and you all can ask your questions.
So this, yes?
Mr. Ambassador, you referred to the remote possibility that the Palestinians and Israelis might be able to find a solution to their conflict if both sides were willing to make tough concessions. Could we focus on the Palestinians, please? And what are the concessions you would expect the Palestinians to be willing to make, and please be specific?
Sure. On the Palestinians, you'd have to focus certainly on the Palestinian Authority. And as I said, I thought that they were deficient at the moment. In a sense, they didn't represent all of the Palestinians. But I said I thought that there were things moving quietly, but not certainly that might bring them together. And I think that the kinds of concessions they would have to make, in effect, are to give away, as is inevitable, 78% of Palestine to the Israelis. And from their point of view, that's a serious concession. Another concession they would have to make is land swaps over the 1967 border, in which they would hope to get land equal in quality and quantity in return for what they swapped. But if you look at the map, you will see how nearly impossible that is as the process goes ahead. But one can look at the whole series of concessions and swaps and other arrangements that have to be made. Certainly, the Palestinians would not be able to exercise a right of return in any way to Israel, although my own view is that those who left in 1948 and who are certainly beyond miracles not of reproductive age, should they wish to return in a situation that might be biased against their returning by rewarding them for staying where they are, ought to have at least that option. And that would be a concession on the part of Israel. But it would be a concession of the Palestinians to give up their hope that they could all return. Do you want to go on?
Yes. Jack.
So recently we've had a lot of discussion of the wisdom of drawing red lines in connection with the Syrians' possible use of chemical weapons. So as just a general principle of diplomacy, when should diplomats and leaders draw red lines? When should they not? And if they do it, how should they do it?
Great question. Red lines began, interestingly enough, with Yitzhak Rabin, who drew some red lines in Lebanon when Syrian forces were present in Lebanon. And those red lines managed to hold. They were not crossed. So obviously, the way to draw red lines is to be sure, in fact, that when you draw it, you're prepared to enforce it. And be wise enough that when you draw it, you'll never have to be called upon to enforce it. Which points out some of the futility of red line drawing. My own view is that if you wish to signal to the other side something that they're doing that you consider to be unacceptable, then you have to consider the consequences and what you're prepared to do, in fact, to enforce your will in that particular case. And that depends on a whole plethora of circumstances. So red line drawing, in my view, is not subject to a series of general principles or propositions, but to a very careful case-by-case examination of what's involved. Because we all know, because every commentator who gets on the radio, wise or not, is telling us today that the dangers of drawing red lines and not enforcing them are maybe even more serious than the dangers of drawing red lines. And I think that's probably true. And so if I were giving advice, I would say go slow on red lines. Figure out what you're going to do beyond drawing red lines, if you want to say it, so that you have a plan and you have an understanding of what you're going to do. And then you have an understanding of the chessboard beyond that. Red lines is not even playing checkers. And so in many ways, we need to be very careful about what we do, but we understand that if that particular red line is of such serious importance that we're going to use military force to defend it, then before we do it, we need to examine all the ramifications of that and put it in play.
Yes. Lady in the front.
Hi, Ambassador. Thank you so much for speaking to us today. My name is Emily. I'm a first year here at SEPA and also a fellow Pickering. I think there are several of us in attendance today. I wanted to ask, you offered some suggestions about the restructuring of the Security Council, but how likely and in what time frame do you really believe that that's possible, because there's so many complexities to Security Council? Thank you.
It's a very good question. I think that we're likely to get increased memberships for a while of important large players as non-permanent members of the council, elected for 2 years. I don't think we're likely to get any expansion of the council or the selection and approval of any states as new permanent members in the foreseeable future. And I don't think that we're likely to get any change in the veto for the foreseeable future. So I think we're going to putt along sort of with what we've already developed. There may be some people with some better ideas out there who could move things a little bit, but I think it will be procedural, a little more open meetings for other members to attend and perhaps participate in, things of that sort, which have been on the table and are being used, but could perhaps be increased.
Yes.
Thank you, Mr. Ambassador. My name is Yiğit Canay. I'm a first-year student at SIPA, thanks to the mid-career training that Turkish Foreign Service is providing me. My question will be on the role of social diplomacy, and where do you see the use of social media by diplomats evolving? There are some proponents of the use of Twitter who say it's a communication today and it cannot be avoided by the diplomats. But how healthy it is to communicate the delicate message in those two short sentences? Do you desire a world where everyone is reading the two short lines and not reading the whole press statements, the full text? And just to reflect on your recent piece in Washington Post on presidents are breaking the back of foreign service, I'd like to ask quickly, do you think the US has missed the point to be an exemplary bureaucracy of a merit-based system for the rest of the foreign services around? Thank you.
Thanks. Both very good questions, and thank you. I think that social media, as long as people are looking at it, has obviously a huge potential in the degree to which it's looked at to affect views and attitudes. There was a wonderful story on NPR yesterday about a man who left his wallet in a bag on a train. And he went to his entire Twitter community and say, hey, anybody see my bag? It was this color, and I left it on a train between here and there. And could you tweet it for me? And so people tweeted out, and they found a lady who had picked it up, who had taken it to the police but hadn't heard from them, but who had gotten his name from a card in the wallet. And they got back together, and he got his wallet back. So it may not be that it's totally nefarious. I think that the two-liner is a very difficult way to convey a kind of complicated message, and will always be subject to distortion. But if the two-liner piques your interest in looking into a particular problem, then it's worthwhile. And that may be. I think that you'll have to tell me, does Twitter destroy intellectual curiosity or engage it? And how good are you at the latter, and how poor at the former? And how and in what way should foreign offices, for example, look at this? A real tendency toward blogs because they're self-selecting, they have subject matter criteria more or less, and they push things ahead. And for years, the US has been blogging in Arabic on a number of places in the Middle East where it felt it could get a good hearing. The US had big problems with Al Jazeera, in Arabic in particular. But my view always was, go send a team of our best Arabists to Qatar and lean on the Qataris to give you a half an hour a day. And on any subject you wanted or whatever subject they wanted. And go on a talk show and obviously get the opportunity in Arabic to get their tremendous exposure and to talk about the issues that they were raising. And give people an opportunity to see, okay, what was your view? What was your side of the question? Whether they would have never done that or not, I don't know, but at one time, I think it was in the range of possibility. So I believe it's fabulously significant for public diplomacy. I think there are also now people who read blogs in particular to get a sense of what popular opinion is on various issues. Immediately, it's self-selecting, but sometimes the ideas are very interesting. And sometimes you get a very good sense of what's preoccupying people in the chat that goes back and forth on a number of these kinds of sites. And so I think that's worth looking at too. And it is a very interesting device for measuring public opinion, particularly in places that might be more restricted in terms of access. Certainly, you're not going to stop it, although I think China has worked hard to see if it can find a way to filter it, and other governments may seek to do that. I think users, while it's more costly and sometimes more difficult, are often even cleverer in finding ways around it.
Yes.
Well, thank you, Ambassador, for your information. My name is Marvin. I'm a first-year graduate student at NYU and also a Pickering Fellow. My question is regarding the environment, energy, and climate change. For the future of the Arctic, given that it's the most warming, fastest warming region of the Earth, how do you see the United States and our foreign policies really gearing towards this change and leading on the Arctic change and the energy that's possible available there in the Arctic? Thank you.
Well, I think that one of the most interesting things is that Secretary Clinton began to attend Arctic Council meetings, along with other foreign ministers. As it became apparent that ice-free areas were increasing, that there was new access potentially to resources, that trade routes and transit routes were going to become more significant across the Arctic, and that the Arctic Council, while it is an organization of the littoral states, those that had, under the law of the sea, to which we are not yet parties, claims to various jurisdictional arrangements in the Arctic, that, I think, has been very helpful. There is very clearly a strong sense that others may wish to become part of it. The Antarctic Treaty, because it doesn't recognize any claims, is open to adherence by any state. And so there'll be a little bit of scramble and some elbowing over the question of whether the Arctic Council is the exclusive body or whether other places and other people can join, whether observers will have equal status and so on. And I think that's something we need to keep our eye on, and it'll be part of Arctic diplomacy as we go down the road. The more difficult questions will certainly be things like the extension of the continental shelf and how it's defined and who has part of what under the law of the sea arrangements. They're useful, but they are not so clearly dispositive as to define forever with no hint of doubt and no negotiation what the arrangements are. And of course, for many countries, they're heavily invested in the potential of future Arctic energy resources and their own role in that. So that's important. There are environmental questions that I think are very important. Still a very fragile area. I think particularly with increasing ship transit, you want to be sure that the ships are capable of withstanding the worst weather, that things like oil spills are very dangerous. They provide long-standing and I think very deleterious conditions for what's happening in the Arctic, and we need to be very careful about that. So there are a whole host of problems. Consulting in the Arctic Council, using the international legal basis, but in my own view, we need to think about the expansion of participation in this, what role the expansion will take, how and in what way non-littoral states will participate, what are the places that they have in that part of the area. You can't fence off, well, of course, the whole high seas, and we've not done that, but it is interesting.
Yes.
Thank you for the engaging discussion today, Ambassador. My name is Lila. I'm a second-year student and also a Pickering Fellow. When you mentioned Syria and the unlikelihood that a leader would come to the negotiating table willing to give up their seat in power, that seems reasonable, but it also called to mind the case of Yemen recently. And so I'm wondering if you think that was just an anomalous case, or if you think there are certain things that should call the attention of the international community, given that we're probably going to have to face similar problems in the future. And I'm particularly interested in your view on the regional organizations and if the constellation of actors it matters a lot in those situations.
Well, I think the first thing is important is that Ali Abdullah Saleh in Yemen ran out of supporters, if he had any. Bashar Assad has not. And so a major effort to move toward a political settlement would involve certainly first Russia, and then I think secondarily, but not unimportantly, Iran. And they need to be convinced that the option they have chosen isn't going to work. And that's an important, and that therefore they can be engaged in an option that has some chance of working and some chance of preserving for them opportunities in the region. That's all I can say. That's the major piece. But those are the differences between the two. I do think that the Arab League has become, in its position taking since January of 2011, remarkably robust, much beyond where we expected it would go. Willing in these difficult circumstances to hang together. So willing, in fact, that it has identified itself with the Syrian opposition as an organization which has taken the Syrian seat in the Arab League. This has not particularly helped the political process where Lakhdar Brahimi represents both the United Nations and the Arab League, and he's now in the difficult position of representing an organization which has adhered itself to only one side in the conflict. And that will have to be something that over time will have to be worked out if that's going to have any continued salience.
Any more questions? Okay.
Yes, thank you. I'm Dr. Polner. I'm president of Cinema Verite International. Excuse me. Thank you, Ambassador, for your interesting presentation. I have two questions, the first of which is that if chemical weapons have been used and if they continue to be used, how do you see that as a game changer in Syria? And my second question is the impact on Lebanon of what is going on in Syria. It appears that Lebanon is being drawn more and more into the conflict. Can you comment on both of those? Thank you very much.
Sure. I think that chemical weapons have an enormous potential to kill very large numbers of people, particularly in concentrated areas. And one suspects that if the government, which has access to those kinds of weapons, uses them, they will use them for that purpose, and the casualty figures will mount. The government may see these as ways to conduct military activity, particularly in urban areas where chemical weapons could be more effective, as a way to advance their position and try to use it to defeat the opposition. The options for riposte in this are limited, but certainly available. One would be to seek to destroy or take possession of the known stockpile areas for chemical weapons and of the missile systems that they use or the artillery systems to deliver them. The latter would be particularly hard because the artillery systems are just like any normal artillery arrangement. Another would be to seek to destroy them from the air, but that runs a serious danger, obviously, of opening up the possibility of large volumes of very lethal nerve agent being passed around, and I have no idea how effective bombs would be against nerve agent in terms of destroying its lethality as you broke open the containers that held it, and that would be a very difficult problem. Lebanon is heavily affected by refugee flows, potentially by elements of both sides seeking to use Lebanese territory to attack the other, and maybe even in a broadened conflict and a more extensive one, either enlisting Lebanese or enlisting Lebanese organizations and creating an offshoot of the Syrian civil war inside Lebanon. So the potential for very bad things to happen in Lebanon is only limited by your imagination, unfortunately.
One last question, and then we
Ambassador Pickering, thank you for coming to Colombia today. My name is Ernesto Alfonso. I'm also a Pickering Fellow. The entire team is here, as you might see that. My question is regarding Latin America. Given the remarkable performance of countries like Chile or even Colombia today, what should be our role, when I say our role, the United States' role and involvement in Latin America today, given that we have countries such as Colombia and Chile, and then we have those that want very minimal involvement from the US or no involvement at all, like Venezuela? That's my question to you. Thank you.
I think on the base, we need to be respectful of two things. The independent rights of countries in the hemisphere to pursue their own future. I think that where we see those inimical to our own or posing dangers to us, which hardly seems fathomable, then we have reason, obviously, to engage them much more intensively in those actions and activities we object to. I think we also ought to be a loyal and full member of all of the inter-hemisphere arrangements that exist, and continue to make our own contribution to that. I think it's important for us to continue to think that promotion of wider trade in the hemisphere has enormous advantages for all of us. In some cases, that's been resisted because we're unwilling to make some of the key compromises, and on the other side, by other states who are unwilling to do so. I see much less fear of U.S. trade potential than I think maybe 40 years ago or 50 years ago would have disturbed Latin Americans. And I think that as a result, there are new opportunities there. I think the most critical and the most demanding issue will be to sit down with the Brazilians, who see themselves as well as certainly the centers of a hemispheric system in the south, much of it centered on Mercosur, as a trading relationship which they would like to maintain, if I could put it this way, top leadership in. And to some extent, we have to see how and in what way our own interrelationships can be useful in making progress. I was delighted that we took the tax off ethanol for the Brazilians. I wasn't delighted, however, that with respect to our dispute over corn, we in effect agreed to pay them off rather than settle the dispute to protect our own protected position on that. So there are things that we could do as we move ahead. I think it's important for us in the hemisphere to think about how and in what way the three large states of North America, as they come closer together, do not end up isolating themselves from the rest of the hemisphere. And so I think that free trade, particularly in Central America, but pushed on down, and maybe even greater pluralization of NAFTA, could be a useful way to think about next steps in the hemisphere. I put a lot of emphasis on trade because we are a very large economic bloc. I think there are also important issues of politics. I don't know that in any way we should be playing the kind of political watchdog role a lot of people would like us to play. I think both the Bush administration and the Obama administration have dealt with Venezuela carefully and wisely. A lot of it has just been to ignore it. Where we can't change it, it's probably better not to make a big issue out of it. And similarly with Ecuador and Bolivia. And I think that over a period of time, people in those countries will have to understand and make their own way as to where they're going. And I don't see that the administrations they had in power were delivering all of the goods, but we should be careful not in underestimating the effect that Chavez had on particularly the rural poor in Venezuela, and getting into a fight on that ground, on that issue, over essentially ideological grounds was a mistake, and I think we avoided it. But it's a question of those kinds of roles and those kinds of approaches that I think will play a role. And we need to continue, I think, to find a way to build and strengthen those countries in the hemisphere who are prepared to go with us on the further democratization of the hemisphere. But I would hope that we would let them play a major role in doing that rather than putting ourselves out in front and trying to shoo them along behind us. Thanks.
Well, thank you very much. I think I speak on behalf of all of us in saying that we have seen what great diplomacy is all about. That is a combination of being able to take the 40,000 feet view, the strategic view, and at the same time, a granular knowledge of issues as diverse as the Arctic, the impact of trade issues on North Carolina, evolution of militias in Syria. That's really a formidable performance that you have given Ambassador Pickering, and on behalf of all of us, I really want to thank you.